The scream that tore through the birthing room was not Alara's mother crying out in pain. It was the silence after that made every wolf in the house go still. A newborn was supposed to howl. That was the law of the Moonstone Pack, older than any written rule, older than the stone walls of the pack house itself. The moment a pup drew its first breath, its wolf stirred inside it and let out a small, sharp cry that echoed through the bond every pack member shared. It was how a pack knew a child was truly one of them. It was how a family celebrated a birth. Alara made no such sound. The midwife, an older woman named Odalise, who had delivered nearly every child in Moonstone for the last 30 years, held the baby against the lamplight and waited. She waited for the tiny howl, the flicker of gold that sometimes passed behind a newborn's eyes when the wolf inside first opened them. Nothing came. The baby only blinked, confused by the brightness, and let out an ordinary human cry, the kind any child anywhere might make. Miriam Voss, still pale and shaking from labor, reached for her daughter with trembling arms. "Give her to me," she whispered. Odalise hesitated. She had never hesitated before. In 30 years of catching pack children as they entered the world, she had never once held a baby who did not carry a wolf. She looked at the small face, red and scrunched and utterly ordinary, and felt a chill she could not explain. "Something is wrong," Odalise said quietly, more to herself than to anyone in the room. Those 4 words would follow Alara for the rest of her life. Her father, Callum Voss, beta of the Moonstone Pack, and second only to the alpha in rank and pride, stood by the door with his arms crossed. He had been listening for the howl the way every father listened, counting the seconds, ready to throw open the doors and announce his daughter to the pack. When the seconds became a full minute, and the minute became 5, his face changed. The pride drained out of it, and something colder took its place. "Check her again," he said. Odalise pressed her fingers gently along the baby's small chest, feeling for the flutter of a second heartbeat, the subtle rhythm that marked a wolf soul bonded to a human one. There should have been 2 pulses, human and wolf, moving together like a quiet drum. She felt only one. "There is no wolf," Odalise finally said. "I am sorry, Callum. I do not know how, but there is no wolf." The room went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the night air slipping through the window. Miriam pulled her daughter closer, as if she could shield her from the words already spoken, already impossible to take back. Callum did not move. He simply stared at the child in his wife's arms, as though she were a stranger who had wandered into his house wearing his daughter's face. "That is not possible," he said. "No child of mine could be born hollow." "She is not hollow," Miriam said, her voice breaking. "She is ours. Whatever she is ours." But Callum was already walking away, already thinking of what this meant for his position, for his family's honor, for the respect he had spent his whole life building among the pack. A beta with a wolfless daughter was not a beta anyone would trust to lead. Wolves depended on strength passed through blood. A child with no wolf at all was worse than weak. She was proof, in the eyes of the pack, that the Voss bloodline had failed. He did not return to the room again that night. By morning, word had spread through the entire territory. Servants whispered it in the kitchens. Hunters murmured it as they returned from the forest. Even the young pups, too small to understand what a wolf bond truly meant, repeated the word they had overheard from their parents: Hollowborn. It moved through Moonstone faster than any fire, and by the time the sun rose fully over the pack house, everyone knew that Callum Voss's daughter had come into the world without a wolf. The alpha of Moonstone at that time was a broad, graying man named Garrick Thorne, a leader who valued strength above almost everything else. When Callum came to him that same morning, kneeling with his head low, and asked permission to have the child cast out beyond the territory boundary, Garrick considered it for a long moment. It would have been simple. Packs across the 12 territories had done such things before, quietly, without ceremony, leaving unwanted children at crossroads far from any wolf settlement. No one would have questioned it. No law demanded a pack keep a hollow-born child. But something made Garrick pause. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, who had once told him stories of a girl born without a wolf, who grew up to save an entire village from a hunter's raid, using nothing but her wits. Perhaps it was simple caution, a reluctance to make a decision he could not undo. Whatever the reason, Garrick shook his head. "She stays," he said, "but she will not be raised as pack. She has no wolf, so she holds no rank. no protection beyond what any human servant receives. Let her live, Callum, but do not expect anyone to treat her as your heir. It was not mercy. It was a slower kind of punishment, though no one called it that at the time. Miriam tried, in the months that followed, to shield her daughter from the coldness that had settled over their home. She sang to Alara at night, told her stories, held her the way any mother would hold a beloved child. But the weight of what had happened pressed down on her every single day. She watched her husband grow more distant, more ashamed, more convinced that the child in his house was a mark against his name rather than a daughter to love. She watched the other pack mothers pull their own children away when Alara toddled too close, as though whatever had caused her condition might somehow spread. Grief, it turned out, could take many forms. For Miriam, it took the form of a slow illness that no healer in Moonstone could properly name. She grew thinner through that first year, quieter, as though some essential part of her had simply given up the fight. When Alara was barely 1 year old, her mother closed her eyes one evening and did not open them again. The pack said it was a fever. Some said a broken heart. Whatever the true cause, Alara was left in a house that no longer wanted her, raised by a father who could barely look at her, in a pack that saw her as a walking reminder of failure. She grew up in the kitchens more than in her own family's quarters. The head cook, a kind but weary woman named Beatrix, took pity on the silent little girl who wandered the halls with no one to claim her. Beatrix taught her to peel vegetables before she could properly read, to scrub pots before she learned her own letters. It was not the childhood Abeta's daughter should have had, but it was, in its own strange way, safer than the alternative. In the kitchens, at least, no one expected her to howl. Still, cruelty found its way to her, as cruelty often does to those who cannot fight back the way others expect. The other pack children, growing into their wolves one by one, celebrated their bonds with festivals and pride, running through the training yards with golden eyes flashing, showing off their growing strength. Alara watched from the kitchen windows, her hands raw from dishwater, and felt the ache of being forever on the outside of something everyone else took for granted. By the time she was 6 years old, she understood exactly what she was to the people around her. Not quite pack, not quite servant. A hollow girl who existed in the gaps between both worlds. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that left no mark anyone could see, but that stayed with her all the same. Pack children would knock over the buckets she carried, just to watch her scramble to clean the mess before Beatrix noticed. They called her broken beneath their breath, sometimes not even bothering to lower their voices, as if her feelings mattered as little as her missing wolf. Her own father, on the rare occasions their paths crossed in the halls, would look through her rather than at her, his eyes sliding past as though she were simply another shadow in the corridor. And yet, despite everything, Alara noticed things that no one else seemed to notice about her. The moon, for one. Most wolves in the pack felt the moon's pull as a distant tug, something that grew stronger as the full moon approached and faded once it passed. Alara felt it differently. She felt it as a hum beneath her skin at all times, not tied to any particular phase, steady and constant, like a heartbeat that was not quite her own. She never told anyone this. Who would she tell? Who would believe that a girl with no wolf could feel the moon at all? Animals, too, behaved strangely around her, though she did not understand why for many years. The packhounds, usually loud and territorial with strangers, went quiet and calm whenever she walked near their kennels. Wild birds that fled from every other human in the yard would sometimes land close to her, watching with dark, curious eyes, as if trying to solve some puzzle they sensed in her presence. Alara told herself these were simply small coincidences. She had long since learned not to hope for anything more than an ordinary, difficult life. By the time she turned 16, Alara had grown into a quiet young woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, hardened by years of labor that should never have been hers to carry. She kept her head down, did her work well, and avoided drawing attention whenever possible. Attention, in Moonstone, rarely brought her anything good. It was on an ordinary autumn morning, with frost still clinging to the training yard fences, that Beatrix pulled her aside with unusual urgency in her voice. "The Alpha King is coming," Beatrix said, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "King Draven Ashblood himself. All 12 packs will renew their oaths to him this season, and Moonstone has been chosen to host the ceremony this year." Alara had heard of King Draven, of course. Everyone in the 12 territories had heard of him. He ruled over all the packs, the strongest alpha to have ever unified the wolflands under a single crown, feared and respected in equal measure. Stories about him traveled fast and grew taller with each retelling. Some said his wolf was twice the size of any other alpha's beast. Some said he had never lost a challenge in his life. Elara had always assumed such stories were exaggerated, as most stories about powerful men tended to be. "That has nothing to do with me," Elara said, already turning back to the pot she had been scrubbing. Beatrix caught her arm gently. "It has everything to do with you, child. Garrick has ordered that you serve the king's private quarters during his stay. You will be the one preparing his meals, tending his rooms, seeing to whatever he requires." Elara felt a familiar tightness settle in her chest. This was not an honor. She understood that immediately. Garrick had never once looked kindly on her presence in Moonstone, and assigning the Hollowborn girl to personally serve the most powerful alpha in the land was exactly the kind of quiet humiliation he would enjoy arranging. It was a reminder, dressed up as duty, of exactly how low her place in the world truly was. A king would be waited on by a girl with no wolf at all, and everyone watching would understand the insult buried inside the arrangement. "When does he arrive?" she asked, keeping her voice even. 3 days, Beatrix said. "The whole pack is already preparing. You will need proper clothes, Elara, something better than kitchen rags. I will see what I can find." 3 days. Elara spent them the way she spent most days, working until her hands ached, though an unfamiliar nervousness had settled beneath her ribs that she could not quite name. She told herself it did not matter who the king was, or how grand his reputation might be. She would serve his meals, clean his quarters, and remain as invisible as she had trained herself to be for the last 16 years. Kings came and went. Pack politics rose and fell like tides. None of it had ever changed anything for her before, and she saw no reason to believe this would be different. On the morning of the 3rd day, the entire territory of Moonstone gathered along the main road leading into the pack grounds, waiting for the first sign of the royal procession. Elara stood near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a cluster of taller pack members, watching the road with the same detached curiosity she might have given to any spectacle that did not concern her. When the king's guard finally came into view, moving with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had marched together for years, a hush fell over the assembled crowd, and when Draven Ashblood himself rode into the territory at the head of that procession, even the whispering stopped entirely. He was taller than most men Elara had ever seen, with dark hair pulled back from a face carved from sharp, serious lines. He wore no crown, no obvious symbol of his rank beyond the quality of his clothing, and the absolute authority in the way he carried himself. But it was not his appearance that made the crowd fall silent. It was something harder to describe, a presence that seemed to press against the air itself, as though the world had quietly agreed to make room for him. Elara felt it too, even from her place at the back of the crowd. A strange pull, faint but unmistakable, like the moon's constant hum beneath her skin, suddenly growing louder for just a moment, before fading again. She told herself it was simply the natural awe anyone would feel in the presence of a king. She pushed the strange sensation aside, and returned her attention to the tray of refreshments Beatrix had ordered her to prepare for the arrival feast. She had no way of knowing, standing there in the crowd with her plain servant's dress and her carefully lowered eyes, that within a matter of hours, everything she believed about her own life was about to change forever. She had spent 16 years learning to expect nothing from the world. The world, it seemed, had other plans. That evening, as the feast wound down and servants began clearing tables in the great hall, Garrick Thorne found Elara among the kitchen staff and pulled her aside with a look of thin satisfaction on his face. "The king's quarters are prepared," he said. "You will bring his evening meal and see that his rooms are properly tended. Do not embarrass this pack, Elara. Do exactly as you are told. Say nothing unless spoken to, and leave the moment your duties are finished." Elara nodded, accepting the tray Beatrix had prepared, her hands steady, despite the strange nervousness still coiled in her stomach. She told herself this was simply another task, no different from the thousands of tasks she had completed without complaint over the years. She would deliver the meal, tend the rooms, and disappear back into the ordinary invisibility of her life. She had no idea that the moment she stepped through the doorway of the king's private chambers, The life she had always known would end, and something entirely unexpected would begin in its place. The corridor leading to the guest wing felt longer than usual that night, lit by torches that cast long shadows against the stone walls. Alara balanced the tray carefully, her footsteps quiet on the polished floor, rehearsing in her mind the simple, practiced motions of her duty. Enter quietly, set down the tray, tend to whatever needed tending, leave without drawing notice. She reached the heavy wooden door of the king's chamber, and paused for a moment, gathering herself the way she always did, before facing anything uncertain. Then she knocked softly, waited for the low voice within to grant her entry, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was warmly lit, a fire crackling in the hearth, and King Draven Ashblood stood near the window with his back turned, looking out over the darkened training yards of Moonstone. He did not turn immediately at the sound of the door, and Alara used the brief moment to cross the room quietly and set the tray down upon the small table near the fire, exactly as she had been instructed. It was only when she straightened and turned to leave that everything changed. A low sound rumbled through the room, not from Draven's throat but from somewhere deeper, somewhere ancient. Alara froze, watching in confusion and rising alarm as the king turned fully to face her, his expression shifting from mild indifference to something sharp and startled. His eyes, dark only a moment before, flickered gold, then held there, steady and burning, fixed entirely on her. And then, in a way that seemed to defy everything Alara understood about the world, the powerful Alpha King of all 12 packs took a slow step forward, his large frame moving with a strange, unfamiliar hesitance, and lowered himself down before her. He knelt, the Alpha King, whose wolf was said to bow to no one, whose beast had never once yielded in his entire life, sank to one knee on the stone floor of his own chambers, his golden eyes fixed on the wolfless girl standing frozen before him, as though she were something far greater than a servant girl carrying an evening meal. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the silence, and somewhere far beyond the walls of Moonstone, the moon rose higher into the night sky, its pull humming quietly beneath Alara's skin, stronger now than it had ever been before. Draven did not rise for a long moment, and Alara stood rooted to the spot, too stunned to move, too confused to understand what was happening in front of her. Kings did not kneel, alphas did not kneel, least of all before a servant with no wolf, no rank, no claim to anything beyond the dishwater calluses on her hands. And yet there he was, one knee pressed against the stone floor of his own chamber, his golden eyes locked on her, as though she were the most important thing he had ever seen. "Forgive me," he said finally, his voice low and rough, as he rose slowly back to his full height. He looked as unsettled by his own actions as she felt watching them. That has never happened before. Alara found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Your Grace, I do not understand." "Neither do I," Draven admitted. He studied her with an intensity that made her want to step back toward the door, though something else, something she could not name, kept her feet planted where they stood. "My wolf has never bowed to anyone, not to my father before me, not to any alpha across the 12 territories. He does not yield. It is not in his nature. Perhaps he mistook me for someone else," Alara offered, though even as she said it, she knew how foolish it sounded. No one mistook a wolfless servant girl for anyone of importance. Draven shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "What is your name?" "Alara Voss." Something flickered across his face at the mention of the name Voss, a faint recognition, though he said nothing more about it in that moment. "Tell me, Alara, what is your rank within this pack?" She hesitated, unused to being asked such a direct question by anyone, let alone a king. "I have no rank, Your Grace. I was born without a wolf. I serve in the kitchens." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Alara began to wonder if she had said something wrong. Draven's expression had gone still, thoughtful, the golden light fading slowly back into the ordinary brown of his eyes as he studied her with new interest. "No wolf at all," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "and yet my beast knelt before you as though you commanded him." "I command nothing, Your Grace," Alara said quickly. "I only brought your evening meal, as I was instructed." "I understand that," Draven said, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something almost gentle crossed his features. "You have done nothing wrong, Alara. Whatever this is, it is not your doing, at least not a doing you chose. but I intend to understand it." Ilara did not know how to respond to that. Every instinct she had built over 16 years of careful invisibility told her to simply nod, excuse herself, and disappear back into the kitchens where she belonged. Attention from anyone in a position of power had only ever brought her trouble before, but something in the king's steady gaze made it difficult to simply walk away, and before she could decide what to say, he spoke again. "You may go for tonight," he said. "But I will have questions for you tomorrow, and I would ask that you answer them honestly." "Of course, Your Grace." Ilara bowed her head and turned toward the door, grateful for the excuse to leave the strange, charged air of the room behind her. As her hand touched the door handle, she glanced back once, unable to stop herself, and found Draven still watching her, with an expression she could not read, something between confusion and fascination, as though she were a puzzle he had only just discovered existed. She hurried back through the corridors of Moonstone that night, with her heart pounding in a way it never had before. By the time she reached the small servants' room she shared with 2 other kitchen girls, her hands were still trembling. She told herself it was only shock, only the strangeness of the encounter, but sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment the Alpha King's wolf had bent its will before her, wondering what it could possibly mean, and fearing, deep down, that whatever it meant, it would not stay quiet for long. She was right to fear that. By the next morning, word had already begun to spread through the pack house, the way word always did in Moonstone, faster than anyone could contain it. A guard stationed outside the king's chamber the night before had seen enough through the partially open door to understand that something unusual had occurred, and by breakfast, half the kitchen staff were whispering about it, their eyes flicking toward Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "They say the king knelt before you," one of the younger kitchen girls whispered, as Ilara chopped vegetables at her usual station, trying desperately to focus on the mundane task in front of her. "Is it true?" Ilara did not answer, keeping her eyes fixed on the knife in her hands. She had learned long ago that engaging with pack gossip only ever made things worse for her, and this rumor, true as it was, felt far too dangerous to confirm aloud. By midday, Garrick Thorne had summoned her to his private study, his face carrying the same thin, suspicious expression he always wore when Ilara's existence became inconvenient for him. Callum stood beside him, and for the first time in years, her father actually looked at her directly, though the expression in his eyes held no warmth, only a cold, calculating wariness. "Explain what happened last night," Garrick demanded without preamble. "I do not know what happened, Alpha," Ilara said honestly. "I delivered the king's meal as instructed. His wolf reacted in a way I did not expect. I have no explanation for it." "His wolf knelt," Callum said, his voice tight with something that might have been anger, or might have been fear. Ilara could not quite tell which. "The Alpha King's beast, the most powerful wolf in the 12 territories, knelt before a girl with no wolf at all. You expect us to believe you have no explanation?" "I have told you the truth," Ilara said, holding her ground, despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. "I did nothing. I said nothing. I only entered the room." Garrick exchanged a long look with Callum, something unspoken passing between them, that made Ilara's stomach tighten with unease. Whatever they were thinking, she understood instinctively that it did not bode well for her. "You will continue your duties in the king's chambers as assigned," Garrick said finally, "but you will report to me anything unusual that occurs, anything at all. Do you understand?" "Yes, Alpha," Ilara said quietly, though something in his tone made the instruction feel less like simple oversight and more like the beginning of a trap she did not yet fully understand. She left the study with her hands still shaking slightly, though she forced herself to walk steadily through the corridors, aware of the eyes that followed her now wherever she went. Where once she had been invisible, ignored, dismissed as unimportant, she now felt the weight of an entirely new kind of attention, one that made her skin prickle with unease, rather than the familiar ache of being overlooked. That evening, when she once again carried a tray toward the king's chambers, her nerves had not settled at all. She found herself hoping, almost desperately, that the events of the previous night had been some strange, unrepeatable occurrence, a fluke that would not happen again now that the surprise had passed. She knocked, waited for permission, and entered the room with her eyes carefully lowered, determined to complete her task without incident this time. But the moment she crossed the threshold, The same low rumble sounded again, and when she glanced up despite herself, she found Draven's eyes already gold, already fixed on her with the same startled intensity as before. This time, he did not kneel immediately. He seemed to fight against it, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists at his sides, as though physically restraining himself. "It happens every time you enter," he said through gritted teeth, clearly struggling against whatever instinct pulled at him. "Every single time." Ilara set the tray down quickly, her hands unsteady. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I do not know how to stop it." "I am not asking you to stop it," Draven said, and though his voice remained tense, there was no anger in it, only genuine confusion layered beneath careful control. "I am trying to understand what it means. In all my years leading the 12 packs, I have never encountered anything like this. A wolf does not simply choose to kneel. It is not a decision. It is instinct, deeper than thought, deeper than will. And yet mine responds to you as though you hold some claim over him that I cannot see or explain." "I hold no claim over anyone, Your Grace," Ilara said, her voice quieter now. "I was born without a wolf. Whatever your beast senses in me, it is not something I control or understand." Draven studied her for a long moment, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing, though the gold in his eyes did not fully fade. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing toward the chair across from where he had settled near the fire. "Please, I would like to understand more, if you are willing to speak with me." Ilara hesitated. Every rule she had ever been taught about her place in the pack told her that servants did not sit with alphas, let alone with kings. But something in his tone, patient rather than commanding, made her cautiously lower herself into the offered chair. "Tell me about your birth," Draven said, "about growing up without a wolf. I want to understand everything." And so, haltingly at first, and then with growing ease, as the king listened without interruption or judgment, Ilara found herself speaking about things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. She told him about the silent birth, about her mother's grief and early death, about growing up in the kitchens while other pack children trained and howled and grew proud in their bonds. She told him about the strange hum of the moon beneath her skin, the way animals seemed calmer around her, small details she had never shared with a single soul, out of fear that no one would believe her. Draven listened to all of it, with a stillness that suggested he was cataloging every detail carefully in his mind, occasionally asking a quiet question, but mostly simply allowing her to speak. When she finally fell silent, unsure of what else to say, he sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There are old stories," he said slowly, "from before the 12 packs were unified, from before my grandfather's grandfather first claimed the crown. Stories of souls born differently, wolves that do not settle inside a body at birth, the way ours do, but wait instead, bonded not to the child itself, but to a single fated match yet to come. I had always believed such stories were exaggeration, myth built up over centuries of retelling, but I find myself reconsidering that belief tonight." Ilara felt a strange mixture of hope and fear stir in her chest at his words. "You believe I might be one of these? Whatever they are called?" "I do not know," Draven admitted, "but I intend to find out. There is a seer in my capital, a woman named Odessa, older than anyone else in my court, who has studied these old records more thoroughly than any historian alive. If anyone can tell us the truth of what you are, it is her." "Your Grace, I appreciate your concern," Ilara said carefully, "but I do not wish to cause trouble. My presence here already draws unwanted attention. If Garrick and my father learn that you intend to investigate this further, I fear what it might mean for me." Draven's expression hardened slightly at the mention of her father and the Alpha. "They have already noticed, I take it." "They have," Ilara admitted. "Garrick has instructed me to report anything unusual directly to him." "Then you will tell him nothing," Draven said firmly, "and you will trust that I will not allow harm to come to you while you remain under my notice. I do not make that promise lightly, Ilara. I intend to keep it." Ilara looked at him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the careless cruelty she had grown so accustomed to expecting from those in positions of power. She found none, only a steady, serious intent that surprised her more than anything else that had happened over the past 2 strange days. "Why would you concern yourself with me at all?" she asked quietly. "I am nothing, Your Grace. A servant with no wolf, no rank, no claim to importance." Draven's gaze softened, though his voice remained firm. My wolf has never knelt before anyone in his entire existence, Alara. Whatever you are not nothing. I intend to prove that to you, whether you believe it yet or not. Alara did not know how to respond to such a statement, and for a long moment, the two of them simply sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them, the weight of everything unspoken, settling comfortably into the quiet room. When she finally rose to leave, gathering the empty dishes from his earlier meal, Draven watched her with an expression she still could not fully read, though it no longer felt threatening. If anything, it felt almost protective, a quiet promise made without words. She left his chambers that night with her mind spinning, uncertain of what the coming days would bring, but aware, for the first time in her life, that someone with real power had looked at her and seen something worth protecting, rather than something worth discarding. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of pack politics and royal intrigue, but for a girl who had spent 16 years believing herself invisible, it felt like the first crack of light breaking through a very long night. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Alara continued her duties in the kitchens each morning, scrubbing pots and preparing meals as she always had, while carrying the strange, heavy secret of her evenings, spent in quiet conversation with the Alpha King of all 12 packs. She told no one about these conversations, not even Beatrix, who had shown her more kindness over the years than almost anyone else in Moonstone. Some secrets Alara had learned were safer kept entirely to oneself. Draven, for his part, had not been idle. On the third morning after their first strange encounter, he requested access to the pack's official birth records, citing his authority as king to review any documentation he deemed necessary during his stay. Garrick could hardly refuse such a request without raising suspicion, though Alara could see the tension in his shoulders whenever the subject arose, a barely contained anxiety that suggested he understood, on some level, that his careful control over her existence was beginning to slip. The records room in Moonstone was a small, dusty chamber, tucked behind the main hall, filled with generations of birth certificates, death notices, and pack lineage documents stretching back centuries. Draven spent the better part of an afternoon there, accompanied only by his personal guard, a steady and quiet man named Corwin who had served him since childhood, and whose loyalty ran deeper than mere duty. What Draven found troubled him more than he expected. Ilara's birth record existed, as it should, listing her parents, the date, the attending midwife. But when Draven compared it carefully to the records of other children born hollow across the 12 territories, gathered from correspondence he requested from neighboring packs, a pattern began to emerge that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. In every documented case across recorded history, children born without a wolf bond had died within their first year of life, either from illness, from exposure after being cast out, or from causes never fully explained. Not one had survived to adulthood, not one, until Alara. He brought his findings to Odessa, the ancient seer of his own court, through a lengthy written correspondence carried by his fastest riders, describing everything he had learned and everything Alara had shared with him about her strange connection to the moon and the calm she seemed to inspire in animals. The response, when it finally arrived nearly a week later, changed everything. Odessa's letter spoke of an old legend, buried so deep in the oldest pack histories that most modern wolves had never even heard of it. Long before the 12 packs existed as separate territories, before any alpha crown had been forged, the wolf bloodlines had been simpler, wilder, less structured than they had since become. In those earliest days, the legend claimed, certain rare souls were born, whose wolves did not settle inside them at birth, as was now the custom. Instead, these souls carried what the old texts called a waiting wolf, a spirit bonded not to the body it was born into, but to the fate of a single other soul, destined to remain dormant and silent until that fated match was finally found. Such children, the legend explained, always appeared wolfless at birth, indistinguishable from any ordinary human child, which was precisely why the old packs had come to fear and reject them. A silent birth looked like failure. It looked like weakness. No one, across all those centuries, had understood that it might instead be the mark of something far rarer and far more powerful, waiting patiently beneath the surface. Draven read Odessa's letter alone in his chambers that night, the fire burning low beside him, and felt something settle in his chest that he could not quite name. If the legend held any truth at all, it meant that Alara was not broken, Not hollow, not a failure of her bloodline as the entire pack had spent 16 years insisting. It meant she carried something the old wolves themselves would have called sacred, a power patiently waiting for the one soul capable of calling it forward. And his own wolf had knelt before her without hesitation, the very first time they had ever stood in the same room together. He did not share the full contents of Odessa's letter with Alara immediately, wanting to be certain of the details before offering her hope that might prove false. But he could not entirely hide the shift in his demeanor when she next brought his evening meal, the careful, searching way he studied her now, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "You look troubled, Your Grace," Alara observed as she set the tray down, noticing the letter still resting open on the table beside him. "Troubled is not quite the word," Draven said slowly. "I have received word from my seer regarding old legends that may explain what happened between us. I do not wish to speak carelessly of things I do not yet fully understand, but I believe, Alara, that you may be far more than this pack has ever allowed you to become." Alara felt a familiar wariness rise in her chest, the same defensive instinct that had protected her through 16 years of disappointment. Hope, she had learned long ago, was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. "What do you mean?" Draven hesitated, then decided honesty served her better than careful half-truths. He explained what Odessa's letter had described, the old legend of waiting wolves, bonded not to the child, but to a fated match, souls born silent, not because they lacked a wolf entirely, but because their wolf slept, patient and hidden, until the right moment arrived to awaken. Alara listened in silence, her expression unreadable, and when he finished speaking, she said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for some hidden meaning in the flickering flames. "You believe I am one of these waiting souls," she finally said. "I believe it is possible," Draven said carefully. "I do not wish to promise you certainty I do not have, but everything you have described to me, the pull of the moon, the calm you bring to animals, and my own wolf's response to your presence, none of it fits with the idea that you are simply hollow, as this pack has always claimed." "And if I am not hollow," Alara said slowly, testing the words as though they belonged to someone else's life entirely, "what does that mean for me?" "I do not know yet," Draven admitted, "but I intend to find out, and I intend to see you protected while we do." That protection, however well-intentioned, would soon prove far more necessary than either of them expected. Word of Draven's investigation into the birth records, and his subsequent correspondence with the royal seer, had not gone unnoticed by Garrick and Callum, despite their best efforts to keep it quiet. A servant loyal to Garrick had overheard fragments of conversation between Draven and Corwin discussing the old legends, and by the time the story reached Garrick's ears, it had grown into something far more alarming than the truth. "The king believes the girl carries power," Garrick said grimly, pacing the length of his private study, while Callum stood near the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "If that belief spreads, if the pack begins to see her as something more than hollow, everything we have built collapses. Our authority, our standing among the 12 territories, all of it depends on the pack believing that strength comes only through proper bloodlines, properly bonded wolves. A hollow-born girl, elevated to importance, threatens the very foundation of how this pack understands itself." "She has always been a liability," Callum said quietly, though something in his voice suggested even he was uncertain now of exactly how large that liability had grown. "I should have insisted she be cast out at birth, whatever mercy Garrick's father showed her." "What is done, Garrick snapped. "The question now is what we do moving forward. The king cannot remain in Moonstone forever. Once he departs and takes his attention elsewhere, we can address the situation quietly, without royal interference." Callum's jaw tightened at the implication buried in Garrick's words, though he said nothing to object. Whatever affection he might once have felt for his daughter, 16 years of shame and resentment had worn it down to almost nothing, leaving only a cold calculation about what her continued existence might cost him. Neither man knew, as they spoke, that Draven had assigned Corwin to quietly watch over Alara's movements throughout the pack house, a precaution he had taken the moment he began to suspect that Garrick and Callum's discomfort might turn into something more dangerous than simple hostility. It was this precaution that would ultimately save her life, though not before Alara found herself facing the closest brush with danger she had ever experienced. 3 days after Draven shared Odessa's letter with her, As the king's stay in Moonstone stretched toward its second week, Garrick summoned the full pack council to discuss what he framed as growing concerns about outside influence disrupting proper pack order. He did not name Alara directly during the public portion of the meeting, choosing instead careful, coded language about maintaining tradition and protecting the pack's standing among the 12 territories, but everyone present understood exactly who and what he referred to. Alara, working in the kitchens during the council meeting, felt the shift in the pack's mood almost immediately afterward, where once she had been simply ignored, ordinary indifference now curdled into something sharper, more pointed. Pack members who passed her in the corridors offered glares rather than the careful blankness she had grown used to over the years. Whispers followed her more openly now, no longer bothering to lower their voices when she walked past. She said nothing to Draven about the shift at first, unwilling to burden him further, unwilling to seem as though she expected his protection, simply because he had offered it once. But Corwin noticed the change immediately, reporting his observations to Draven, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent years learning to read danger before it fully arrived. "The pack grows restless, Your Grace," Corwin said one evening, standing at attention near the door of Draven's chambers, while Alara cleared away the remains of dinner nearby, close enough to hear every word. "I do not believe Garrick intends open confrontation while you remain present, but I have concerns about what might occur once your stay concludes." Draven's expression darkened. "How much longer must our stay here continue for the ceremony to be properly completed?" "The formal renewal of oaths is scheduled for the coming full moon," Corwin said. 5 more days." "Then we remain vigilant for 5 more days," Draven said firmly, though his eyes drifted toward Alara as he spoke, a silent acknowledgement of exactly whose safety concerned him most. "Alara, I want you to remain within sight of either myself or Corwin, whenever possible during that time. Can you manage that without drawing further suspicion?" "I will try, Your Grace," Alara said, though privately she doubted how much longer she could avoid drawing suspicion at all, given how openly hostile the pack's mood had already become. Her doubts proved well-founded far sooner than any of them expected. 2 days later, Garrick assigned Alara to a task that immediately struck her as unusual, though she had no grounds to refuse it without raising suspicion of her own. She was instructed to travel to the northern edge of Moonstone's territory, near the boundary line shared with a neighboring pack, to deliver a set of documents to a border outpost that handled trade correspondence between territories. It was a task typically assigned to trained messengers, not kitchen staff, and Alara felt an uneasy prickle at the base of her neck as she set out on foot along the forest path leading toward the boundary. The forest grew quieter the further she walked, the usual chatter of birds and small animals fading into an unsettling stillness that made her steps slow with growing wariness. She had grown up hearing stories of the dangers that lurked at territory boundaries, rogue wolves without pack allegiance, dangerous wildlife unaccustomed to human presence, disputes between neighboring packs that sometimes turned hostile. She had never before been sent so far from the pack house alone, and the isolation pressed uncomfortably against her nerves. She did not notice the 2 figures following at a distance through the trees until it was almost too late. They moved with the practiced quiet of pack members trained in tracking and pursuit, staying carefully downwind, closing the distance between themselves and Alara with patient, deliberate steps. She might never have noticed them at all had one not stepped carelessly onto a fallen branch, the sharp crack echoing through the unnaturally silent forest and sending a jolt of alarm through her entire body. Alara spun around, her heart pounding, and found herself facing 2 pack members she recognized vaguely from the training yards, their expressions carrying none of the friendly familiarity that might have suggested an innocent encounter. "You should not have wandered so far alone," one of them said, his voice carrying a cold edge that confirmed every instinct screaming at her to run. She did not wait to hear more. Alara turned and bolted deeper into the forest, her feet finding purchase on the uneven ground, despite the panic clawing at her chest, years of hard labor having at least given her legs the strength to move quickly when survival demanded it. Behind her, she heard the 2 pursuers break into a run as well, their pace far faster than hers, closing the gap with terrifying speed. She did not know how far she managed to run before her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling hard against the forest floor, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. She scrambled to push herself back up, her palms scraped raw against the rough ground, but the two pursuers were already closing in, their shadows falling over her as she struggled to rise. And then, cutting through the forest like a blade, came a sound that stopped everyone in their tracks. A roar, deep and furious and unmistakably powerful, rolled through the trees from somewhere close behind, and a massive shape burst through the undergrowth with terrifying speed, golden eyes blazing in the dim forest light. Draven's wolf, larger and more powerful than anything Alara had ever seen, placed himself directly between her and the two stunned pursuers, his lips pulled back in a silent, threatening display that needed no words to communicate its message. The two pack members, whatever courage had driven them into the forest that day, immediately understood the impossible danger they now faced, and without another word, they turned and fled back through the trees, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Alara remained on the ground, breathing hard, watching as the great wolf turned toward her, his massive form gradually shifting and reshaping until Draven himself knelt beside her in human form once more, his expression tight with barely restrained fury and unmistakable relief. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with an urgency she had not heard from him before. "I am fine," Alara managed, though her hands were still trembling as she accepted his help rising from the ground. "Corwin noticed your assignment to the boundary outpost was irregular," Draven said, his jaw tight with anger that had nothing to do with her. "I followed the moment I understood something felt wrong. I should have insisted you never leave the packhouse grounds without protection. This is my failure, not yours." "It is not your failure," Alara said quietly, though she could not deny how deeply shaken she felt by how close she had come to real harm. "This is what Garrick and my father have wanted for 16 years. I should have expected this." Draven's expression darkened further at her words, something fierce and protective settling into his features. "No one will harm you again while I have breath to prevent it," he said firmly. "Garrick has overstepped the bounds of his authority, endangering a member of this territory under my direct protection. This will not go unanswered." He helped her back through the forest toward the packhouse, his hands steady beneath her elbow, and Alara found herself, for the first time since the terrifying chase began, feeling something other than fear settle over her. Whatever uncertainty still surrounded her strange condition, whatever danger still lingered from Garrick and her father's growing desperation, she was no longer facing it entirely alone. And that realization, small as it seemed against the larger danger still ahead, felt like the first true foundation of safety she had known in her entire life. By the time they reached the packhouse, word of the confrontation in the forest had already begun to spread, carried swiftly by the two pursuers, who had fled straight back to report their failure to Garrick. Draven wasted no time seeking out the Alpha, leaving Alara in Corwin's steady care while he strode through the corridors with a controlled fury that made every pack member scatter from his path. He found Garrick in the Great Hall, standing near the fireplace with Callum at his side, both men wearing carefully composed expressions that did nothing to hide the tension beneath. "Your Grace," Garrick began, "I understand there was an incident in the northern forest." "An incident," Draven repeated, his voice dangerously flat. "Two of your pack members chased down a young woman, under my direct protection, intending her harm. I would not call that an incident, Garrick. I would call it an attack. I assure you, Your Grace, I gave no such order," Garrick said smoothly, though the slight flicker in his eyes told a different story to anyone paying close attention. "If pack members acted independently, I will see them properly disciplined." "You will do more than discipline them," Draven said. "You assigned Alara to travel alone to the boundary outpost, a task entirely inappropriate for kitchen staff, and conveniently timed the very week I made clear my interest in her well-being. I am not a fool, Garrick, and I will not pretend to believe this was mere coincidence." Callum stepped forward then, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, with respect, this pack has managed its own affairs for generations, without outside interference. Alara's situation is a pack matter, not a matter for royal concern." Draven turned his full attention on Callum, and something in his gaze made even the hardened Beta take an involuntary step back. "She is your daughter," Draven said, his voice low and cold, "and you speak of her as though she were a stray animal, to be managed rather than disposed of at your convenience. I have watched this pack treat her with nothing but cruelty, for reasons she never chose and could not control. That ends now." Ilara Voss is under my direct protection for as long as I remain in this territory, and any further harm that comes to her, whether by direct action or by convenient accident, will be treated as a direct offense against the crown itself." The great hall fell utterly silent at the weight of that declaration. Garrick's jaw tightened, and Draven could see the calculation happening behind the Alpha's eyes, weighing the cost of open defiance against a king who held authority over every pack in the 12 territories. "As you command, Your Grace," Garrick finally said, though the words came through gritted teeth. Draven held his gaze a moment longer, making certain the message had fully registered, before turning and striding from the hall without another word. He found Ilara waiting in the small antechamber outside his quarters, still pale from the events of the afternoon, Corwin standing watchfully nearby. "It is done," Draven said, some of the tension easing from his shoulders now that the confrontation had passed. "Garrick understands, at least for now, that further action against you will not be tolerated." "For now," Ilara repeated quietly. "But you will not remain in Moonstone forever, Your Grace. Once you depart, whatever protection your presence offers disappears with you." Draven was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. He had already been turning the same thought over in his own mind throughout the walk back from the Great Hall, and her voicing it aloud only strengthened the decision already forming. "Then you will not remain in Moonstone either," he said. Ilara blinked, startled by the sudden shift in his tone. "Your Grace? Come with me to my capital when I depart," Draven said, the words coming out with more certainty than he had expected to feel. "You will be safe there, properly protected, and Odessa can examine you directly, rather than relying on letters exchanged across the territories. Whatever truth exists about what you are, it deserves to be uncovered properly, not investigated secondhand, while you remain in danger here." Ilara stared at him, the offer settling over her with a weight she struggled to fully absorb. Leave Moonstone, leave the only home she had ever known, however unkind that home had proven to be, and travel to the capital of the 12 packs with a king who had, in the span of little more than a week, upended every assumption she had ever held about her own worth. "I have nothing to offer you in return for such generosity," she said finally, uncertain of what else to say. "I am not asking for anything in return," Draven said, his voice softening slightly. "I am asking because I do not believe you are safe here, and because I intend to understand what happened between my wolf and you, the moment you walked into my chambers. Those 2 reasons alone are enough." Ilara considered his offer through the remainder of that evening, lying awake in the small servants' room she shared with 2 other kitchen girls, staring up at the same familiar ceiling she had studied every night for as long as she could remember. Leaving Moonstone meant leaving behind everything predictable about her life, however painful that predictability had often been. It meant stepping into a future she could not map or control, dependent entirely on the goodwill of a king she had known for barely a week. But staying meant remaining within reach of Garrick and her father's growing desperation, remaining a target for whatever further cruelty they might arrange, once Draven's watchful presence no longer shielded her. And beneath all the fear and uncertainty, a small, persistent voice reminded her of the strange hum beneath her skin, the pull of the moon that had never made sense to her, the possibility, however faint, that she might finally understand what she truly was. By morning, she had made her decision. "I will come with you, Your Grace," she told Draven when she brought his breakfast that day, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you believe the truth is worth finding, I would like to find it too." Something shifted in Draven's expression at her answer, relief mixed with something warmer that he did not yet name aloud. "Then we depart in 3 days. Once the formal renewal of oaths concludes, I will see to your safety personally until then." The 3 days that followed passed with an uneasy tension hanging over the entire packhouse. Garrick, forced into public compliance by Draven's earlier declaration, could do nothing openly to interfere, though Ilara noticed the way his eyes followed her whenever their paths crossed, calculating and resentful. Callum avoided her entirely, retreating into a cold silence that felt, in its own way, almost like relief, as though her impending departure solved a problem he had never wanted to face directly. Beatrix, upon learning of Ilara's decision to leave with the king's party, pulled her into a tight embrace that startled them both with its intensity. "I always knew there was more to you than this pack ever gave you credit for," the older woman said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Go, child. Find whatever truth waits for you out there. You have earned far better than what Moonstone ever offered. The formal renewal of oaths took place on the night of the full moon, exactly as tradition demanded. Alara watched from a careful distance as Garrick knelt before Draven in the great hall, renewing Moonstone's fealty to the crown, in the ceremonial words passed down through generations, his voice carrying none of the warmth such words traditionally required, though no one present dared comment on it aloud. When the ceremony concluded, and the pack's obligatory celebration began winding down into the late hours of the night, Draven found Alara waiting near the edge of the training yard, watching the moon hang full and bright above the tree line. "Tomorrow we depart," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I know," Alara said quietly. "I have spent the whole evening trying to memorize this place, strange as that sounds. 16 years of my life happened here, even if most of them were not kind." "You do not have to forget it," Draven said. "Only leave it behind for something better, if that is what waits ahead." Alara turned to look at him, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, and found herself, not for the first time since their strange first meeting, wondering what exactly the pull between them meant, beyond whatever ancient legend Odessa's letters described. "Do you truly believe I might be something more than hollow, Your Grace? Or is this simply your wolf's instinct leading you toward kindness you would not otherwise show a stranger?" Draven considered the question seriously before answering. "I have led the 12 packs for nearly 10 years, Alara. I have met countless people during that time, powerful alphas, cunning advisors, dangerous enemies, and quiet, unremarkable souls who wanted nothing more than to live their lives in peace. Not one of them, in all those years, ever made my wolf react the way he reacts to you. Whatever kindness I offer, it is not born from obligation or pity. It is born from certainty that something important stands before me, something worth protecting and understanding, whatever the old legends ultimately prove to be true or false." Alara did not know how to respond to such honesty, so she simply nodded, allowing the silence between them to settle comfortably, rather than forcing words into a moment that needed none. Above them, the full moon climbed higher into the clear night sky, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the constant hum beneath her skin did not feel like a lonely, unexplainable burden. It felt, instead, like the quiet beginning of an answer she had waited her entire life to find. The next morning, as the king's procession prepared to depart Moonstone's territory, Alara stood at the edge of the training yard with a small bundle containing the few possessions she owned in the world, watching the pack house that had been both her home and her prison for 16 long years grow smaller behind her, as the road stretched ahead toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Beatrix waved from the kitchen doorway until she disappeared from sight entirely, and Alara felt, despite everything uncertain still waiting ahead, a lightness in her chest she had never once experienced within Moonstone's walls. Whatever waited for her at the capital, whatever truth Odessa's ancient knowledge might reveal, she was walking toward it now, with her head held high, for the very first time in her life, no longer the silent, wolfless girl the pack had cast aside, but someone whose story, she was beginning to believe, had only just started to unfold. The journey to Draven's capital took the better part of a week, winding through forested hills and open valleys that Alara had never seen beyond the borders of Moonstone's territory. She rode within the royal procession, seated in a covered carriage most days, though she often found herself drawn to walk alongside it whenever the terrain allowed, unwilling to spend the entire journey hidden away from the wide, unfamiliar world unfolding around her. Corwin rode close beside her during much of the journey, and though he remained a quiet, watchful presence, rather than an easy conversationalist, Alara found a certain comfort in his steady company. He answered her questions about the capital and the surrounding territories with patient thoroughness, describing the great stone city of Ashwood Hold, seat of the Alpha King's power, nestled against tall mountains that had sheltered the Ashblood line for generations. "You will find it very different from Moonstone," Corwin told her one afternoon as they crossed a wide sunlit valley. "The capital holds representatives from all 12 territories, wolves of every rank and background. It can feel overwhelming at first, but the king's protection carries real weight there. No one crosses him lightly within his own walls." "And Odessa?" Alara asked. "What is she like?" Corwin's expression grew thoughtful. "Old, in ways that go beyond simple age. She has served 3 generations of the Ashblood line, and some say she remembers stories that predate even the earliest written pack histories. She can seem strange, even unsettling, when you first meet her, but her knowledge has guided the crown through more crises than I could easily count. If anyone can tell you the truth of what you are, it is her. Draven himself rode at the head of the procession most days, though he made a point of joining Alara each evening, once the caravan settled into camp for the night, sharing meals with her away from the watchful eyes of the wider traveling party. Their conversations during those quiet evenings grew easier with each passing day, the careful formality of their first strange encounter gradually softening into something that felt, to Alara's growing surprise, almost like genuine friendship. She learned, during those evening conversations, that Draven had become king, far younger than most alphas ever claimed such authority, his father having died suddenly, when Draven was barely 20 years old, thrusting the full weight of the 12 territories onto shoulders that had expected years more of preparation. He spoke of those early years with a rare, unguarded honesty, describing the loneliness of a crown that demanded constant strength, constant certainty, even when he had felt neither in the private moments no one else witnessed. "I have not spoken this openly to anyone, in a very long time," he admitted one evening, watching the campfire crackle between them. "Most who surround me want something from the crown, and even those who do not still see the crown before they see the man wearing it. It is a lonely thing, being certain no one around you speaks entirely without calculation." "I have nothing to gain from you, Your Grace," Alara said quietly. "Perhaps that is why you find it easier to speak honestly with me." "Perhaps," Draven agreed, studying her across the firelight with an expression she still struggled fully to interpret. "Though I confess it is more than that. There is an ease in your presence I have not felt with anyone else, crown or no crown between us." Alara felt a warmth rise in her cheeks at his words, unfamiliar and slightly overwhelming, after a lifetime spent guarding herself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. She said nothing in response, though the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled with an understanding neither of them quite dared to name aloud. They reached Ashwood Hold on the 7th day of travel, the great stone city rising into view as the procession crested a final hill, its towers catching the late afternoon sun in a way that made Alara catch her breath despite herself. She had never seen anything built on such a scale, walls that stretched wide enough to house thousands, towers that seemed to touch the very clouds gathering above the distant mountains. The city welcomed its king home with genuine celebration, crowds gathering along the main thoroughfare as the procession made its way toward the central keep. Alara felt distinctly out of place amid the grandeur, acutely aware of her plain traveling clothes and the curious glances that followed the unfamiliar young woman riding so close to the king's own carriage. But Draven made no effort to hide her presence or explain it away, and by the time they reached the keep itself, whispers had already begun circulating through the capital about the mysterious young woman the king had brought back from Moonstone. Odessa awaited them in the keep's private receiving chamber, exactly as Draven had arranged through his earlier correspondence. She was smaller than Alara had expected, her frame slight and stooped with age, her silver hair pulled back in a simple braid, her eyes an unusual shade of pale gray that seemed to hold far more awareness than her frail appearance suggested. She studied Alara intently the moment she entered the room, rising slowly from her seat despite Draven's gesture that she remain comfortable. "So," Odessa said, her voice carrying a rasp that spoke of many decades of use. "This is the girl who made an Alpha King's beast kneel." "Alara Voss," Draven said. "This is Odessa, keeper of the old knowledge and advisor to the crown for longer than I have been alive." "Longer than your father was alive too, young king," Odessa said, with a faint, dry humor that suggested this was a familiar joke between them. She turned her full attention back to Alara, studying her with an intensity that made Alara resist the urge to shift uncomfortably beneath the scrutiny. "Come closer, child. Let me look at you properly." Alara stepped forward, and Odessa reached out with surprisingly steady hands, pressing her palms gently against either side of Alara's face, closing her pale eyes as though listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. The room fell completely silent, even Draven holding perfectly still as he watched the old seer work, and Alara felt an unusual warmth spread from where Odessa's hands touched her skin, not painful but strange, as though something deep within her had suddenly been noticed for the very first time. After several long moments, Odessa opened her eyes and stepped back, her expression carrying a mixture of satisfaction and something almost like wonder. "It is exactly as the old texts describe," she said, turning to Draven. "A moon-born soul. I have read of them in histories so old the language itself has changed twice over since they were written, but I never expected to witness one in my own lifetime." "Explain it to her properly," Draven said. "She deserves to understand fully, not simply hear fragments passed along second-hand." Odessa nodded and gestured for Alara to sit, settling back into her own chair, with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer moved as easily as her mind still worked. "Long before the 12 territories existed as we know them now, child, the wolf bloodlines were far less structured, far wilder in how bonds formed between soul and beast. In those earliest days, certain rare souls were born, carrying what the old texts called a waiting wolf, a spirit that did not settle into the body at birth, as is now the common way, but instead remained dormant, bonded not to the child itself, but to the fate of one other soul yet to be found." "Why would a wolf wait?" Alara asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Why not simply bond at birth like everyone else?" "Because such wolves are not ordinary companions," Odessa said. "They are old souls, powerful ones, bonded through fate rather than birth, meant to awaken fully, only in the presence of the one true match destiny has chosen for them. Until that match is found, the wolf remains silent, waiting, patient, beyond any measure a normal life allows. This is why every recorded case before you died within their first year, child. Without protection, without survival long enough to encounter their fated match, the waiting wolf simply remains dormant forever, and the body carrying it eventually fails without a bonded soul to strengthen it." Alara absorbed this slowly, the weight of Odessa's words settling over 16 years of assumed failure, transforming it into something else entirely. "And you believe my fated match is—" She trailed off, unable to quite finish the thought aloud, though her eyes flickered involuntarily toward Draven. "His wolf knelt before you the very first moment you stood in the same room," Odessa said simply. "In all the old texts I have studied, there is no clearer sign of a fated match finally found. The king's beast recognized what his mind could not yet explain." Draven, who had remained quiet throughout Odessa's explanation, finally spoke, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of vulnerability. "Is there danger in this, Odessa, for either of us?" Odessa considered the question carefully before answering. "The bond, once fully recognized, will only strengthen with time and proximity. Her wolf will begin to awaken gradually, drawing strength from the connection between you. This is not a dangerous process, though it will change her, strengthen her, in ways neither of you can fully predict. The greater danger, I suspect, lies not in the bond itself, but in those who might seek to exploit or destroy it before it fully forms." "Garrick and Callum," Alara said quietly. "Perhaps," Odessa said. "Perhaps others as well, once word of this spreads beyond Moonstone's borders. A moonborn soul bonded to the Alpha King represents a significant shift in power, child, whether you intend it or not. Not everyone across the 12 territories will welcome such a change with open arms." Draven's expression grew serious at this warning, though he reached out, almost without thinking, and rested a steady hand against Alara's shoulder, the gesture carrying more reassurance than any words might have offered. "Then we will face whatever challenges arise together. I did not bring her this far only to see her threatened again." Alara felt the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her traveling clothes, and for the first time since Odessa had begun her explanation, allowed herself to fully absorb what all of this meant. She was not hollow. She had never been hollow. The wolf she had felt calling to her through the moon's constant pull, the strange calm she had always inspired in animals without understanding why, all of it made sense now, woven together into a truth far grander than anything 16 years of cruelty and dismissal had ever allowed her to imagine. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking between Odessa and Draven, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what had just been revealed to her. "Thank you both, for taking the time to find this truth, when it would have been far easier to simply let the questions go unanswered." "Truth deserves to be found, child," Odessa said, "especially truth, so long buried beneath cruelty and misunderstanding. What happens next, however, is a path you and the king must walk together, carefully and with open eyes, toward whatever challenges still wait ahead." That evening, After Odessa had retired and the keep had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Draven found Alara standing alone on a balcony overlooking the sprawling city below, the same full moon that had witnessed their departure from Moonstone, now hanging bright above Ashwood Hold's tall towers. "How do you feel?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Alara considered the question honestly before answering. Overwhelmed, relieved, frightened, in some strange way, of what all of this might mean for the life I thought I understood. 16 years, I believed myself broken, and now I learn I was simply waiting, all along, for something I never knew to hope for. "You are allowed to feel all of that at once," Draven said gently. "This is not a small truth to absorb in a single day." Alara turned to look at him, the moonlight softening the sharp lines of his face into something warmer, more open than the composed authority he carried during daylight hours among his court. "And what do you feel, Your Grace? Learning that fate has apparently chosen you a mate you did not expect, born into circumstances so far removed from your own." Draven considered the question seriously, his eyes never leaving hers. "I feel, Alara, that fate has offered me something rarer than any crown or territory I have ever claimed. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I do not regret a single moment that brought us to this point." The moon hung full and bright above them, its ancient pull humming steadily beneath Alara's skin, no longer a lonely, unexplainable burden, but the quiet promise of something powerful finally beginning to stir. Neither of them spoke again for a long while, content simply to stand together beneath its light, aware that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by a fate neither had chosen, but both were beginning, slowly and surely, to embrace. Life at Ashwood Hold settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm over the following weeks, one that Alara approached with the same careful wariness she had carried through most of her life, though the reasons for her caution had shifted entirely. She was no longer bracing herself against cruelty or dismissal. Instead, she found herself adjusting to something far stranger, genuine kindness, offered freely and without hidden cost, from people who had no reason to know her at all. Draven arranged for her to have proper quarters within the keep, modest by royal standards but grander than anything Alara had ever known, with a soft bed and a window overlooking the training yards below. He assigned a young attendant named Wren to help her settle into the unfamiliar routines of court life, teaching her the customs and expectations of a place so different from the kitchens of Moonstone that Alara sometimes felt she had stepped into an entirely different world. Wren, cheerful and unguarded in a way that Alara found both refreshing and slightly bewildering, quickly became something close to a friend, the first Alara had ever truly had outside the careful, distant kindness Beatrix had shown her over the years. "You should see your face," Wren said one morning, laughing as she helped Alara navigate the unfamiliar layout of formal court dress. "You look like someone waiting for the floor to fall out from under you." "Old habits," Alara admitted, allowing a small smile despite herself. "I am not accustomed to people being kind without expecting something in return." Wren's expression softened at that, though she did not press further, simply continuing her work with a gentler patience than before. It was a small kindness, but it meant more to Alara than Wren likely understood. Another quiet reminder that the world beyond Moonstone's cruelty operated by very different rules than the ones she had spent her entire life learning to survive. The changes within her own body, meanwhile, continued gradually, exactly as Odessa had predicted. Alara noticed it first in small ways, her senses sharpening beyond what any ordinary human should experience, hearing conversations from further away than seemed possible, catching scents on the wind that carried information she could not have named a month earlier. Her strength grew too, subtly at first, then more noticeably as the weeks passed, tasks that had once left her muscles aching, now completed with an ease that startled her. Odessa met with her regularly during this period, monitoring the changes with careful, scholarly interest, occasionally consulting the oldest texts in the royal archives for further guidance on what to expect, as the bond between Alara and Draven continued strengthening. "The awakening progresses steadily," Odessa observed during one such meeting, studying Alara with her characteristic intensity. "Your wolf grows stronger with each week you spend in proximity to your fated match. Soon, I believe, you will hear more than the moon's constant pull. You will begin to sense your wolf directly, a presence within you, rather than simply an echo felt from a distance." "How will I know when that happens?" Alara asked, unable to fully imagine what such a sensation might feel like after a lifetime of its absence. "You will know," Odessa said simply. "There is no mistaking a wolf's first true stirring, child, however long delayed it may have been." Draven, despite the many demands of ruling the 12 territories, made a consistent effort to spend time with Alara whenever his duties allowed, walking with her through the keep's gardens in the evenings, sharing meals together away from the formal expectations of court dining. Their bond, whatever ancient magic bound it together, deepened steadily during these quiet hours, built not merely on the strange pull between their wolves, but on a genuine understanding that grew with every honest conversation they shared. He told her, during one such evening walk through the gardens, about the responsibilities that weighed most heavily on him as king, the constant balancing act between the 12 territories' competing interests, the loneliness of decisions that affected thousands of lives but could only ever be made by one person alone. "You do not have to carry all of it silently," Alara said gently, as they paused beside a fountain that caught the last light of the setting sun. "I understand, perhaps better than most, what it feels like to carry burdens no one else seems willing to help shoulder." Draven looked at her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded passing across his features. "I have never had anyone offer to share that weight before, Alara. Most who surround me either fear the crown too much to speak honestly, or want something from it too badly to offer help without calculation." "I want nothing from your crown," Alara said quietly. "I only want to understand you, as you have taken the time to understand me." It was in that quiet moment, beside the fountain, with the sun sinking low behind the mountains, that Draven reached out and gently took her hand, the gesture careful and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. Alara did not pull away. Instead, she let her fingers curl around his, the warmth of the connection settling something deep within her chest that she had not realized remained unsettled until that very moment. "Alara," Draven said softly, "I know this bond was not something either of us chose consciously. Fate decided this for us, long before either of us understood what it meant. But I want you to know that whatever fate began, I choose to continue it freely, of my own will, because I have come to care for you deeply in the time we have spent together, not merely because my wolf recognized yours." Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, so different from every dismissive word she had grown accustomed to hearing throughout her life. "I choose this too," she said quietly. "Whatever fate intended, I am grateful for where it has led me, and grateful most of all for you, Draven. Not simply for the king you are, but for the man who chose to see me as something worth protecting, when everyone else in my life saw only failure." The moment stretched between them, quiet and full, the fountain's gentle sound, the only noise breaking the peaceful evening air. When Draven finally leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead rather than her lips, the restraint in the gesture spoke more clearly than any bolder action might have, a promise of patience, of respect for the newness of what they were building together, rather than rushing towards something neither of them was fully ready to claim. Not every development during those weeks at Ashwood Hold, however, carried such gentle warmth. Reports continued arriving from Moonstone through Draven's network of loyal informants, and the news they carried grew increasingly troubling as the weeks progressed. Garrick, humiliated by the king's public rebuke, and increasingly desperate to reassert his authority within his own territory, had begun quietly reaching out to other alphas across the 12 territories, testing the waters for support against what he characterized, in careful private correspondence, as an overreach of royal authority into pack affairs. Most alphas, wary of directly challenging the crown, offered little more than polite non-committal responses to Garrick's overtures, but one name kept surfacing in the reports that troubled Draven more than any other: Loris Blackwood, alpha of the Ironwood Pack, a territory bordering the northern reaches of the 12 territories, long known for harboring ambitions toward greater power than his current rank allowed. "Blackwood has met with Garrick twice in the past month," Corwin reported, during one of the regular briefings Draven held in his private study. "The content of their discussions remains unclear, but the pattern is concerning, Your Grace. Blackwood has never shown particular loyalty to your father's line, and his territory holds considerable military strength should he choose to test that loyalty openly." Draven's expression grew grim as he considered the implications. "Continue monitoring the situation closely. I want to know the moment their private discussions move toward anything resembling coordinated action." Elara, present for many of these briefings at Draven's insistence that she remain informed of any developments affecting her safety, felt a familiar unease settle in her chest at the mention of growing opposition. "This is my fault," she said quietly once Corwin had departed. "If I had never come to the capital, Garrick would have no cause to seek allies against you." "This is not your fault," Draven said firmly, taking her hands in his own. "Garrick's cruelty toward you long predates any bond between us, Elara. His current maneuvering reveals only his own ambition and fear, nothing about your worth or the choices that brought you here. Whatever conflict may come, it exists because small men fear losing power they never deserved to hold so completely, not because of anything you have done." Elara wanted to believe him fully, and mostly, she did. But the growing weight of political tension hanging over the capital served as a constant reminder that whatever peace and happiness she had found at Ashwood Hold remained fragile, threatened by forces far larger than the simple, personal cruelty she had spent her life learning to survive. The stakes, she understood with growing clarity, had shifted far beyond her own individual safety, extending now into the wider balance of power across all 12 territories. That night, as she lay awake in her quarters listening to the distant sounds of the sleeping capital beyond her window, Elara felt something stir deep within her chest, faint but unmistakable, different from the familiar hum of the moon's pull that had accompanied her for as long as she could remember. It felt, for just a moment, like a low, distant howl, echoing from somewhere far beneath the surface of her own being, as though something ancient and powerful had finally begun, however faintly, to stir awake. She sat up slowly in the darkness, one hand pressed against her chest, waiting to see if the sensation would return. When it did, stronger this time, unmistakable in its presence, Elara felt a smile spread slowly across her face. The first genuine, unguarded smile she could remember, in longer than she cared to admit. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whatever conflict Garrick and Blackwood's quiet scheming might eventually bring, Elara understood in that moment that she was no longer facing any of it, as the hollow, powerless girl Moonstone had spent 16 years convincing her to believe herself to be. Something powerful was awakening within her, slowly but surely, and for the first time in her entire life, Elara Voss began to understand exactly what it might mean to finally, truly, howl. The following morning, Elara sought out Odessa before her usual duties began, eager to share what she had felt during the night. She found the old seer already awake, seated in the small sunlit study where she spent most of her mornings surrounded by stacks of ancient texts, her pale eyes lifting immediately as Elara entered, as though she had been expecting the visit. "Your wolf has stirred," Odessa said before Elara could speak a word, a knowing smile touching the corners of her weathered mouth. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself this morning, child. There is a new steadiness in you that was not present yesterday." "I felt something," Elara confirmed, settling into the chair across from Odessa's desk. "A kind of low howl, deep inside my chest. It frightened me at first, and then it felt wonderful. That is precisely how the old texts describe it," Odessa said, pulling one weathered volume closer and running a thin finger along a passage written in a script Elara did not recognize. "The waiting wolf's first stirring is often described as both alarming and joyful in equal measure, a recognition finally breaking through years, sometimes centuries, of patient silence. It will grow stronger now, steadily, with each day you spend near your fated match." "What should I expect next?" Elara asked. Odessa considered the question carefully. Physical strength beyond ordinary human limits, sharper senses, a deeper connection to the moon's cycles than you have already experienced. Eventually, when the bond reaches its fullest strength, you will be able to call your wolf forward entirely, taking the shifted form the way any bonded wolf might, though I suspect yours, given how long it has waited and how much power it has gathered in that waiting, will prove far stronger than an ordinary wolf's first shift. The idea both thrilled and unsettled Elara in equal measure. She had spent her entire life watching pack members shift between human and wolf form with practiced ease, an ability she had long ago accepted she would never possess. The thought that she might finally join them, might finally understand from the inside what that transformation felt like, seemed almost too large to fully absorb. "Will it hurt?" she asked, unable to keep the vulnerability from her voice. Odessa's expression softened at the question. The first shift can be uncomfortable, child, as any body adjusts to entirely new sensations. But for a bond as strong as yours appears to be, I suspect the process will come more naturally than you fear. Your wolf has waited a very long time for this moment. I do not believe it intends to make the arrival difficult. Over the following weeks, Alara's transformation continued steadily, each day bringing small but unmistakable changes that gradually reshaped her understanding of her own body and capabilities. Her reflexes sharpened until she found herself catching falling objects before conscious thought even registered they had begun to fall. Her hearing extended far beyond ordinary human range, allowing her to catch fragments of conversation happening in distant corners of the keep, a skill she quickly learned to consciously suppress out of respect for others' privacy. Draven took a personal interest in helping her adjust to these growing abilities, spending time with her most afternoons in a private section of the training yards, away from the curious eyes of the wider court. He taught her the basics of controlled combat, not the brutal fighting style of pack warfare, but careful, disciplined movement, designed to help her understand and trust her rapidly strengthening body. "You move differently than you did a month ago," he observed one afternoon, watching as she executed a defensive stance he had shown her only days before, her form already more confident and precise than it had any right to be after such limited practice. "Your wolf teaches you as much as I do, I think, even before you have fully claimed your shifted form." "It feels strange," Alara admitted, lowering her guard and wiping sweat from her brow despite the cool afternoon air. "For so long, my body felt like something separate from whatever I truly was inside. Now, it feels as though the two are finally beginning to agree with each other." Draven smiled at that, a warm, genuine expression that had grown more frequent in her presence over the weeks since their arrival at Ashwood Hold. "That is precisely what the bond does, Alara. It brings the wolf and the soul into alignment, strengthening both in the process. I imagine, given how long yours waited, the alignment will prove more profound for you than for most." Their training sessions became a cherished part of Alara's daily routine, offering not only physical growth but also precious time, spent simply in Draven's company, away from the political pressures that continued mounting beyond the walls of their private practice. She learned to read his teaching style, patient but exacting, never allowing her to settle for less than her genuine best effort, yet always offering encouragement rather than harsh criticism when she struggled with a new technique. It was during one such session, nearly 6 weeks after their arrival at Ashwood Hold, that Alara first felt the full pull of transformation stirring within her, stronger and more insistent than any of the small stirrings she had experienced before. They had been practicing a defensive maneuver when Alara suddenly stumbled, an intense heat spreading rapidly through her entire body, her vision sharpening and blurring in confusing waves as something powerful surged beneath her skin, demanding release. "Draven," she gasped, dropping to her knees as the sensation intensified. "Something is happening." Draven was at her side immediately, his own eyes flashing gold with concern, and something else, a recognition of what he was witnessing. "Let it come, Alara," he said urgently, his hands steady on her shoulders. "Do not fight it. Your wolf is ready. Trust it." Alara closed her eyes, fighting against every instinct that told her to resist the overwhelming sensation, and instead, allowed herself to simply let go, surrendering to the powerful force building within her chest. The transformation that followed felt nothing like the pain Odessa had cautioned might occur. Instead, it felt like a long-held breath finally released, her body reshaping itself with a fluid, natural grace that suggested her wolf had indeed been waiting patiently for exactly this moment, fully prepared for its long-delayed arrival. When the transformation completed, Alara found herself standing on 4 powerful paws rather than 2 feet, her senses exploding with information her human form had never been capable of perceiving. Colors shifted subtly. Scents carried entire stories she could suddenly read with startling clarity, and her body hummed with a strength that felt both entirely new and somehow deeply, permanently familiar. Draven stood before her in human form, his expression carrying open wonder as he took in the sight of her fully realized wolf for the very first time. She was larger than an ordinary wolf, her fur a striking silver that seemed to catch and hold the afternoon light, her eyes, when she caught her own reflection in a nearby pool of water, burning with the same steady gold that marked Draven's own wolf. "You are magnificent," Draven said quietly, and even without words, Elara understood the depth of feeling behind his simple statement, felt it resonate through whatever invisible thread now connected them more completely than ever before. She spent that first hour in wolf form simply exploring the sensation of her new body, running along the edges of the private training yard with a joy she had never experienced in her entire human life, testing the strength of her new muscles, the sharpness of her new senses, the sheer, exhilarating freedom of finally being whole, in a way 16 years of rejection had convinced her she would never know. When she finally shifted back to human form, exhausted but glowing with an inner light that had nothing to do with physical fatigue, Draven wrapped a warm cloak around her shoulders and pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as though he might never let go. "I told you," he murmured against her hair, "that you were never nothing, Elara. I only wish every soul who ever doubted you could see you now." News of Elara's completed transformation spread through the capital within days, and though most of the court received the news with genuine celebration, eager to witness the rare wonder of a moonborn soul finally awakened, Draven remained cautious about how far the news might travel beyond Ashwood Hold's walls. He understood, better than anyone, exactly how such news might be received by Garrick and Callum back in Moonstone, and how it might further embolden whatever alliance Loris Blackwood continued quietly building against the crown. His caution proved well-founded. Within a fortnight, reports arrived confirming Elara's worst fears about the growing conspiracy taking shape beyond the capital's protective walls. Garrick and Blackwood had moved beyond careful private discussions into something far more concrete, drawing additional alphas into their circle, with promises of expanded territory and reduced royal oversight should their planned challenge to Draven's authority succeed. "They frame it as a matter of tradition," Corwin reported grimly during an urgent briefing, called the moment the full extent of the conspiracy became clear. Garrick argues that the crown's protection of a moonborn soul, elevated above her birth rank, threatens the proper order that has governed pack succession for generations. Blackwood uses this argument to gather support from alphas already resentful of royal authority over their territories. "How many packs have they drawn into this alliance?" Draven asked, his expression grim. "3 confirmed, Your Grace, with 2 more showing troubling sympathy toward their position. Combined, their forces would represent a significant challenge to the crown's military strength, though still smaller than the full loyalty you could call upon from the remaining territories." Draven's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information, and Elara, standing quietly beside him throughout the briefing, felt the familiar guilt she had struggled against for weeks resurface with renewed intensity. Whatever joy she had found in her newly awakened wolf, whatever happiness had blossomed between herself and Draven during their weeks together at Ashwood Hold, all of it now stood threatened by a conflict that traced its roots directly back to her own unlikely existence. "I will not allow this to become a war fought over my presence here," Elara said firmly, once Corwin had departed, and only she and Draven remained in the private study. "If my leaving would end this conflict before it fully begins, I will return to Moonstone, or wherever else might satisfy Garrick's demands." Draven turned to face her, his expression fierce in a way she had not seen from him before, though the fierceness carried protection rather than anger. "You will not leave, Elara. This conflict was never truly about you. It is about small men who fear losing power they never rightfully deserved, using your presence as convenient cover for ambitions they have harbored for years. Garrick and Blackwood would find another excuse for their challenge if you vanish tomorrow. I will not sacrifice you to delay an inevitable confrontation by even a single day." "Then what do we do?" Elara asked, though something in her had already begun steadying itself, her newly awakened wolf, lending her a courage that felt entirely different from the careful survival instincts that had guided her through 16 years in Moonstone. "We prepare," Draven said simply. "For whatever confrontation comes, we prepare together, and we ensure that when Garrick and Blackwood finally show their hand fully, they find far more strength waiting to meet them than they have accounted for in their calculations." Elara nodded, feeling the weight of the coming conflict settle over her shoulders alongside a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She was no longer the silent, wolfless girl who had spent 16 years accepting whatever cruelty the world offered without complaint. Whatever battle lay ahead, she intended to meet it not as a victim awaiting rescue, but as someone finally strong enough, finally whole enough, to stand and fight for the life and love she had only just begun to claim as truly her own. The weeks that followed brought a shift in atmosphere throughout Ashwood Hold, the easy warmth of the previous months giving way to the focused urgency of a court preparing for conflict. Draven summoned his military advisors, loyal alphas from the territories that had never wavered in their support of the crown, and began the careful work of assessing exactly what strength stood ready to meet whatever challenge Garrick and Blackwood's alliance might eventually bring. Alara found herself included in these preparations, in ways she never would have imagined possible only months earlier. Draven insisted she attend the strategic councils, valuing her perspective not despite her unusual background, but because of it, understanding that her years spent unseen and unheard within Moonstone's walls had given her insights into pack politics that many of his more traditionally raised advisors lacked entirely. "You understand Garrick's mind better than anyone in this room," Draven told her during one such council, when several of his advisors had grown frustrated trying to predict the Alpha's next move. "You spent 16 years watching him rule, watching how he thinks, watching what motivates his decisions. Tell us what you see." Alara considered the question carefully, drawing on years of careful, quiet observation she had never before had reason to voice aloud. "Garrick fears appearing weak above almost everything else," she said slowly. "He agreed to spare my life at birth, not from kindness, but from caution, unwilling to make a decision he could not later justify if circumstances changed. That same caution will guide him now. He will not commit fully to open conflict with the crown unless he believes victory is nearly certain, and he will look constantly for opportunities to appear, as though circumstances forced his hand, rather than his own ambition." Draven's advisors exchanged thoughtful glances at this analysis, several nodding slowly as they considered the implications. "Then he will wait for a provocation," one of the older alphas suggested, "something he can point to as justification for his actions, rather than striking first himself." "Precisely," Alara agreed, "which means Blackwood, whose ambitions run deeper and more openly than Garrick's caution allows, will likely be the one to force the issue, using Garrick's grievances as cover for his own desire for greater territory and influence." Draven studied her with open pride at the sharpness of her analysis, and Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with her newly awakened wolf, and everything to do with finally being valued for exactly who she was, insights and all, rather than dismissed for what she had once been believed to lack. Her training continued alongside these strategic preparations, and with each passing week, Alara's control over her wolf form grew more confident and complete. She learned to shift at will, no longer requiring the overwhelming surge of emotion that had triggered her very first transformation, and her strength and speed in wolf form began to rival, and occasionally surpass, even seasoned warriors who had spent their entire lives training within the capital's elite guard. Corwin, tasked with overseeing much of her combat training alongside Draven's more personal instruction, found himself increasingly impressed by her rapid progress. "I have trained warriors for over 20 years, Your Grace," he told Draven privately, after watching Alara best two of his most skilled trainees in a single afternoon's practice. "I have never seen anyone advance so quickly, wolf-born or otherwise." "Her wolf waited a very long time to finally emerge," Draven said, watching Alara from across the training yard with unmistakable pride. "I imagine it intends to make up for lost time." Not all the news that reached the capital during this period, however, concerned military strategy or Alara's growing strength. A message arrived one afternoon from an unexpected source, carried by a lone rider who identified herself only as a former kitchen worker from Moonstone, seeking passage to deliver a private letter directly into Alara's hands. Alara recognized the handwriting immediately upon opening the sealed letter, her heart clenching with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. It was from Beatrix. The letter described conditions in Moonstone that had grown increasingly tense since Alara's departure, with Garrick's growing preoccupation with his alliance against the crown leaving daily pack operations increasingly neglected. Beatrix wrote candidly of her fears for the ordinary pack members caught in the middle of Garrick's ambitions, of families who wanted no part of open conflict with the crown, but found themselves swept along by decisions made entirely without their input or consent. She wrote too of Callum, whose involvement in Garrick's schemes had grown deeper in recent weeks, driven by a desperate desire to reclaim standing he believed Alara's departure had cost him. Alara read the letter twice, feeling old, complicated emotions stir within her at the mention of her father, emotions she had not fully examined since leaving Moonstone behind. Whatever cruelty and neglect had defined their relationship throughout her childhood, some small part of her still carried the ache of a daughter who had once hoped, however foolishly, that her father might someday see her differently. She shared the letter with Draven that evening, watching his expression grow troubled as he read Beatrix's careful, worried words. "Your father chooses his path with open eyes," Draven said gently, once he had finished reading. "Whatever pain that choice causes you, it is his own to bear, not a burden you must carry on his behalf." "I know that," Alara said quietly. "And yet I find myself hoping, even now, that some part of this conflict might still be resolved, without further harm coming to anyone, my father included, however little he has ever deserved such hope from me." Draven reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I share that hope, Alara, truly. I have never sought conflict for its own sake, and I would welcome any path that avoids open war between the territories. But I fear Garrick and Blackwood's ambitions have already carried them too far to turn back easily, whatever hope either of us might hold for a peaceful resolution." His fears proved well-founded within the week. A formal message arrived at Ashwood Hold from Blackwood's territory, carried by an emissary whose carefully neutral expression did little to soften the demands contained within the sealed scroll he presented before the full royal court. The message, signed jointly by Blackwood, Garrick, and 3 additional alphas whose territories had joined their growing alliance, demanded that Alara be formally stripped of any royal protection and returned to Moonstone's authority, citing ancient pack law regarding the proper jurisdiction over Hollowborn individuals. It further demanded that Draven acknowledge publicly that his earlier intervention in Moonstone's affairs had exceeded his royal authority, a demand carefully worded to force either humiliating public retraction or open confrontation. The royal court fell into stunned silence as Draven read the demands aloud, and Alara felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her, some sympathetic, others carrying the wary calculation of advisors already weighing the political cost of the conflict now clearly unavoidable. Draven set the scroll down slowly, his expression carrying a controlled fury that Alara had only glimpsed once before, during the tense confrontation in Moonstone's Great Hall following the forest attack. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire chamber with unmistakable authority. "I will not retract a single word of my earlier declaration," he said firmly. "Alara Voss is not Hollowborn, as this alliance continues to insist, despite clear evidence to the contrary. She is Moonborn, bonded by fate rather than birth, and she stands under my protection, not as an act of exceeded authority, but as the rightful exercise of a king's duty to protect those under threat within his own territories. If Garrick, Blackwood, and their allies wish to challenge that protection through open conflict, I will meet that challenge, fully and without hesitation." The emissary's expression remained carefully neutral as he absorbed the king's response, though Alara did not miss the slight widening of his eyes at the direct, unwavering confirmation of exactly the confrontation his masters had likely hoped to avoid needing to fully commit to. "I will carry your response back to my Alpha and his allies, Your Grace," the emissary said finally, offering a stiff bow before departing the chamber. Once the doors closed behind him, the full weight of what had just occurred settled over the assembled court. War, however carefully both sides had maneuvered to avoid claiming responsibility for its beginning, now stood unmistakably ahead, unavoidable and rapidly approaching. Draven turned to Alara, his expression softening from the fierce authority he had shown the emissary, into something more personal, more vulnerable. "I am sorry it has come to this," he said quietly, once most of the court had dispersed to begin the urgent preparations his declaration now demanded. "I wish I could have found a path that spared you from becoming the center of a conflict not truly of your making." "You have nothing to apologize for," Alara said firmly, taking his hands in her own. "I chose to stand beside you, Draven, fully understanding the risks that choice might eventually bring. I do not regret that choice now. Whatever conflict lies ahead, Garrick and Blackwood built this ambition long before I ever entered your life. I refuse to carry guilt for decisions that were never truly mine to make." Draven studied her for a long moment, something like wonder mixing with the fierce protectiveness that had defined so much of his behavior toward her since their very first strange encounter in Moonstone. You continue to surprise me, Alara. Even now, facing the prospect of war, you meet it with more courage and clarity than warriors who have trained for battle their entire lives. I spent 16 years surviving cruelty I never chose, Alara said quietly. I think, in some strange way, that taught me exactly the kind of strength this moment now demands. I am done being afraid, Draven. Whatever comes next, I intend to face it standing beside you, not hidden away for my own protection. Draven pulled her into a fierce embrace, and Alara felt, beneath the growing tension and uncertainty of the coming conflict, a steady, unshakable certainty settle over her. Whatever battles lay ahead, whatever cost the coming days might demand, she would not face them as the powerless, hollow girl Moonstone had once convinced her she was. She would face them as exactly what she had finally become, a moonborn soul, fully awakened, standing beside the king who had seen her worth before she had ever fully understood it herself. The following weeks passed in a blur of urgent preparation, the entire capital transforming into something resembling a city bracing for siege. Draven's loyal alphas began mobilizing their own territory's forces, gathering at Ashwood Hold in growing numbers, as messengers carried word throughout the loyal territories of the confrontation now unavoidably approaching. Alara spent her days moving between strategic councils and continued combat training, her body and mind both sharpening with a focused intensity that left little room for the fear that might otherwise have overwhelmed her. Odessa, too, played her part in these preparations, poring over ancient texts in search of any additional knowledge about moonborn souls that might prove useful should the conflict eventually require Alara to fight alongside Draven directly. She found little beyond what she had already shared, the old legends offering scattered fragments rather than complete guidance, though she continued her research with unflagging dedication regardless. The old texts suggest moonborn souls, once fully awakened, carry strength beyond even the most powerful ordinary wolves, Odessa reported, during one late evening session in her cluttered study. Alara seated across from her, while Draven reviewed troop positions with Corwin in the adjoining chamber. This makes sense, given how long your wolf waited to emerge, gathering strength through patience that ordinary wolves never require. I suspect, child, that you may prove more formidable in the coming conflict than even you yet realize. Alara absorbed this information with a mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty. Despite months of training, despite the confidence she had gradually built in her newly awakened abilities, the prospect of facing real conflict, potential violence directed at people she had once called neighbors, and packmates however unkindly they had treated her, remained a weight she carried carefully, unwilling to let it show too openly, before those who now looked to her, in some strange way, as a symbol of hope against the growing threat. Word finally arrived, nearly 2 months after Blackwood's emissary had delivered his alliance's demands, that the combined forces of Moonstone, Ironwood, and their 3 additional allied territories had begun moving toward the capital's borders, no longer content to wait for further negotiation or delay. Draven called his full council together the moment the report reached him, and the mood within the chamber carried the unmistakable weight of a conflict no longer theoretical, but immediately, urgently real. They march for the eastern approach, Corwin reported, indicating positions on the large map spread across the council table. Their combined forces number significant strength, though our loyal territories still hold advantage in both numbers and position, should we choose to meet them before they reach the capital itself. Draven studied the map with careful, focused attention, weighing the strategic implications of each possible response. We meet them at Thornfield Valley, he said finally, indicating a wide open expanse roughly a day's ride from the capital's borders. The terrain favors defensive positioning, and it keeps any conflict well clear of the capital's civilian population. The council quickly fell into the detailed work of finalizing battle preparations, and Alara found herself included fully in these discussions, her insights into Garrick's likely tactical thinking proving valuable once again, as the assembled alphas debated how best to counter the approaching alliance's strategy. That night, as the capital settled into its final hours of uneasy calm, before the army's planned departure toward Thornfield Valley, Draven found Alara standing alone, on the same balcony where they had first spoken openly about the strange bond fate had woven between them months earlier. "Tomorrow we march," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I know," Elara said, though her voice carried none of the fear she might once have expected to feel facing such a moment. "I am ready, Draven. Whatever tomorrow brings, I intend to stand beside you, not hidden away in the capital, awaiting news like a spectator to my own fate." Draven turned to face her fully, his expression carrying the weight of a leader who understood exactly what the coming battle might cost, balanced against a fierce pride in the woman standing before him, so far removed now from the fearful servant girl who had first entered his chambers months earlier. "I would not ask you to hide, even if I wished it," he said. "You have earned your place in whatever comes next, Elara, as fully as any warrior who has trained for battle their entire life." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, and Elara leaned into the touch, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his presence. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Draven continued, his voice growing softer, more personal, "I want you to know that these past months with you have been the truest happiness I have known since claiming this crown. Whatever fate first bound us together, I choose you now, fully and completely, not because my wolf demands it, but because my heart does." "And I choose you," Elara said quietly, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, though they carried no sorrow, only the overwhelming fullness of a heart that had spent 16 years believing itself unworthy of exactly this kind of love. "Whatever comes tomorrow, Draven, know that finding you, finding this life beside you, has been worth every hardship that led me here." Their kiss that night, finally shared beneath the same moon that had first drawn their fated bond together months earlier, in Moonstone's cold, unwelcoming halls, carried none of the careful restraint of their earlier, gentler affection. It carried instead the full weight of everything they had built together, and everything they intended to protect, whatever the coming battle might demand of them both. Dawn broke gray and cold over Ashwood Hold the following morning, the assembled army gathering in the capital's wide central square, before beginning their march toward Thornfield Valley. Elara rode near the front of the procession alongside Draven, her wolf form ready to emerge the moment battle demanded it, her heart steady, despite the enormity of what lay ahead. They reached Thornfield Valley by mid-afternoon, and Draven's forces spent the remaining daylight hours establishing careful defensive positions along the valley's favorable terrain, preparing for the confrontation that scouts confirmed would arrive with Garrick and Blackwood's combined forces by the following morning. That night, as the loyal army settled into an uneasy camp beneath the same full moon that seemed to follow every significant moment of Elara's unlikely journey, she found herself unable to sleep, her mind turning over every possible outcome the coming battle might bring. She left her tent quietly, careful not to disturb the guards positioned nearby, and made her way to a quiet rise overlooking the valley, needing a moment alone with her thoughts before whatever the dawn would bring. She was not alone for long. Draven found her there within the hour, settling beside her without a word, simply offering his steady presence, as they both watched the moon climb higher above the valley, that would, by morning's light, become a battlefield. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Elara admitted honestly. "Not for myself, entirely. I fear what tomorrow might cost the people I once knew in Moonstone, however unkindly most of them treated me. I fear for Beatrix, and for the ordinary pack members who never chose this conflict, but find themselves swept into it regardless of their own wishes." Draven considered her words carefully before responding. "That fear does you credit, Elara. It reflects a mercy and compassion that too many warriors lose sight of once conflict begins. I share that same hope, that whatever battle tomorrow brings, it might yet resolve with as little unnecessary loss as possible." Dawn arrived far too quickly, the gray morning light revealing the combined forces of Garrick and Blackwood's alliance gathering at the far end of Thornfield Valley, their numbers stretching impressively across the open terrain, banners bearing the sigils of 5 different territories snapping in the cold morning wind. Draven rode forward to the front of his own assembled forces, and Elara moved to stand beside him, her wolf form already stirring beneath her skin, ready to emerge the moment the confrontation demanded it. Across the valley, she could make out Garrick's familiar figure at the head of Moonstone's forces, and beside him, a tall, broad-shouldered man she recognized immediately, even from a distance, as Loris Blackwood, alpha of the Ironwood pack. A tense silence stretched across the valley, as both sides assessed each other's positions, neither immediately committing to the violence both understood was now unavoidable. It was Blackwood who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying across the open terrain, with the confident authority of a man who believed victory already assured. "Your Grace," he called out, his tone carrying open mockery beneath its formal address. "Return the hollow girl to Moonstone's authority, and this conflict ends before it fully begins. Surely even you understand the foolishness of risking war over a servant with no wolf." Draven's expression remained perfectly composed, though Alara could feel the controlled fury radiating from him at Blackwood's deliberate provocation. "She is not hollow, Blackwood," he called back, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "And she is not merely a servant to be returned or dismissed at your convenience. She is Moonborn, my fated match, and she stands under my protection as fully and rightfully as any soul within the 12 territories. If you wish to test that protection through open conflict, I will not hesitate to meet your challenge." Beside Blackwood, Alara watched Garrick shift uncomfortably, his expression carrying none of Blackwood's confident aggression, and for a brief moment, she wondered if the caution that had always defined the Moonstone Alpha's decisions might yet offer some final opportunity to avoid the violence both armies now stood poised to unleash. That opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, vanished the moment Blackwood raised his hand and gave the signal for his forces to advance. The battle that followed unfolded with a chaotic intensity that Alara would remember for the rest of her life, in fragmented, overwhelming pieces, rather than any clear, linear sequence. She shifted into wolf form the moment the first ranks of Blackwood's forces surged forward, her powerful silver form moving through the resulting chaos with a speed and precision that startled even the seasoned warriors fighting alongside her. She fought not to kill, whenever any alternative presented itself, but to disable and protect, using her considerable strength to pull wounded allies from danger, to intercept attacks aimed at vulnerable positions within Draven's forces, to hold defensive lines that might otherwise have collapsed under the Alliance's aggressive assault. Draven fought nearby throughout the battle's chaos, his own wolf form a fierce, powerful presence that carved a path through the enemy ranks with disciplined, controlled strength, always positioning himself, whenever possible, to keep Alara within sight and protected from the battle's most dangerous concentrations of conflict. The tide of battle shifted several times throughout that long, exhausting day, neither side gaining decisive advantage, despite hours of continuous, grueling conflict. It was, in the end, not raw strength or superior numbers that finally turned the confrontation's outcome, but a single moment of clarity that arrived when Alara found herself facing Garrick directly across a chaotic stretch of the battlefield, both of them momentarily separated from the wider fighting surrounding them. Garrick, in human form, staff in hand, stared at the massive silver wolf standing before him, and Alara watched, even through her wolf's different perception, as recognition slowly dawned across his features. "Alara," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of shock and something almost like shame. "This is truly you." Alara shifted back to human form, standing before the man who had spent 16 years dismissing her existence, who had ordered her family's shame sealed away in silence, rather than showing even the smallest mercy a child deserved. "It is truly me, Garrick," she said steadily. "Moonborn, not hollow. Everything you and my father believed about my worth was wrong from the very beginning." Garrick's grip on his staff wavered, the fierce determination that had carried him this far finally cracking beneath the weight of confronting, directly and undeniably, exactly how wrong his 16 years of judgment had truly been. "I believed I was protecting the pack's proper order," he said quietly, though the words carried little conviction now, exhausted by a day of brutal, ultimately pointless conflict. "You were protecting your own pride," Alara said, not unkindly, though her voice carried no forgiveness either. "Whatever order you believed you protected, it never justified the cruelty you allowed a helpless child to endure." Around them, the battle's chaos seemed to slow, as though the wider conflict itself had noticed this quiet, decisive confrontation unfolding at its edges. Garrick lowered his staff slowly, the fight visibly draining from him as the full weight of the day's losses and the 16 years of judgment that had led him to this moment finally settled over him completely. "I yield," he said quietly, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "Moonstone yields. This conflict ends here, whatever cost it has already claimed." The words spread quickly across the battlefield, and gradually, the fighting began to slow and stop entirely, as Garrick's forces, seeing their alphas surrender, laid down their arms one by one. Blackwood, isolated now without Moonstone's support and facing the full weight of Draven's still largely intact forces, had little choice but to follow Garrick's example, his ambitions finally, decisively crushed beneath the reality of a battle he had badly miscalculated. As the valley slowly fell silent, the day's violence finally ended. Elara found Draven making his way toward her through the aftermath, his expression carrying exhaustion, but also unmistakable relief and pride. He pulled her into a fierce embrace the moment he reached her, and Elara allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything the long, brutal day had demanded of her. "It is over," Draven murmured against her hair. "Whatever comes next, Elara, the worst of this conflict has finally passed." Elara held onto him tightly, watching over his shoulder as Garrick knelt formally before Draven's assembled commanders, beginning the long, difficult process of surrender and reconciliation that would need to follow such a costly confrontation. Whatever came next, whatever consequences Garrick, Blackwood, and their allies would face for the choices that had led to this bloodied valley, Elara understood that the 16 years of cruelty and dismissal that had once defined her entire existence had finally, truly, come to an end. The weeks following the battle at Thornfield Valley brought a different kind of work to Ashwood Hold, quieter than the urgent military preparations that had consumed the capital in the months before, but no less demanding. Draven convened a formal council to address the consequences of the failed rebellion, and Elara, though she might once have shied away from such proceedings, found herself standing firmly beside him throughout the difficult process of restoring order to the 12 territories. Blackwood, whose ambition had driven the conflict from careful political maneuvering into open, costly warfare, faced the harshest consequences. Draven stripped him formally of his position as Alpha of the Ironwood Pack, exiling him from the 12 territories entirely, his fate left to whatever uncertain future awaited beyond the borders he had once ruled. The remaining allied territories, having joined the rebellion with less personal ambition and more genuine grievance, received lighter sentences, their alphas required to publicly renew their oaths of loyalty under close royal oversight for a period of several years. Garrick's fate proved the most complicated to determine, and Draven spent considerable time in private discussion with Elara before finally reaching his decision. Though Garrick had ultimately surrendered and shown genuine remorse in the battle's aftermath, his 16 years of cruelty toward Elara, culminating in his willingness to lead armed conflict against the crown itself, could not simply be forgiven or forgotten. "What would you have me do?" Draven asked her one evening, as they reviewed the final terms of Moonstone's punishment together in his private study. "You have more right than anyone to decide what consequence fits the harm he caused you." Elara considered the question carefully, weighing 16 years of accumulated pain against the strange, quiet mercy she found herself feeling, now that her own life had grown so full and secure, beyond anything Moonstone had ever offered her. "Strip him of his title," she said finally. "Let Moonstone choose new leadership, someone who will govern with more compassion than Garrick ever showed, but do not exile him entirely. Let him live out his years within the territory he once ruled, watching it flourish under leadership wiser than his own. I think that consequence, quiet as it seems, will weigh on him far more than any harsher punishment might." Draven studied her with evident respect at the wisdom behind her chosen mercy. "It shall be done exactly as you wish," he said, and within the month, Garrick formally relinquished his position as Alpha of Moonstone, replaced by a younger, more measured leader, whose first official acts included formally rescinding every discriminatory practice that had once defined the Pack's treatment of Hollowborn children. Callum's fate, Elara decided after much private reflection, required a different kind of resolution entirely. She traveled personally to Moonstone, once the immediate aftermath of the conflict had settled, accompanied by Corwin's careful protection, seeking a final conversation with the father, who had never truly claimed her as his own. She found him in the modest quarters he now occupied, stripped of the status and privilege his former position as Beta had once afforded him, his expression carrying a weariness that spoke of genuine reflection during the difficult months since her departure. "I did not expect you to come," Callum said quietly, when she appeared in his doorway. "I did not expect to come either," Elara admitted, "but I found I could not move forward fully without saying what needed saying, however difficult that conversation might prove." They spoke for nearly an hour, Ilara sharing, honestly and without cruelty, the full weight of what his rejection had cost her throughout her childhood. The loneliness, the constant ache of believing herself unworthy of even basic paternal affection. Callum listened without interruption, his expression carrying genuine shame as he absorbed, perhaps for the first time, the full human cost of decisions he had once justified, through pride and fear of pack judgment. "I cannot undo 16 years of failure as your father," he said finally, when Ilara had finished speaking. "I do not ask for forgiveness I have not earned, but I am glad, Ilara, truly glad, that you found the life and love you deserved, however far removed that finding was from anything I ever offered you." It was not the reconciliation Ilara might once have dreamed of as a lonely child scrubbing pots in Moonstone's kitchens, but it offered a kind of closure she had not realized she still needed until she finally received it. She left Moonstone that day with a lighter heart than she had expected, the last threads of her painful childhood finally, properly resolved. Beatrix, waiting eagerly to see her upon her return to the pack house, pulled her into another fierce embrace, tears streaming freely down her weathered face. "Look at you," she said, holding Ilara at arm's length to properly take in the transformation the past months had wrought. "Moonborn, mate to the Alpha King himself, and still, I am glad to see, the same kind heart that used to sneak extra bread to the kennel dogs when she thought no one was watching." Ilara laughed at that, a full, genuine sound that carried none of the careful restraint she had once needed to survive within these walls. "Come with me, Beatrix," she said suddenly, the idea forming fully formed, the moment she spoke it aloud. "Come to Ashwood Hold. You showed me more kindness during my years here than anyone else in this pack. Let me finally repay even a small portion of that kindness properly." Beatrix's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with fresh tears as she nodded, unable to find words adequate to the offer. Within the month, she had relocated permanently to the capital, taking up a comfortable position overseeing the royal kitchens, finally receiving, in her own later years, the recognition and respect her decades of quiet kindness had always deserved. Back at Ashwood Hold, life gradually settled into a new, peaceful rhythm, following the conflict's resolution. Draven's rule, already respected before the rebellion, grew even stronger in its aftermath, the 12 territories witnessing firsthand exactly how far their king would go to protect those under his care, whatever their birth circumstances or perceived worth. It was on a clear evening, nearly 6 months after the battle at Thornfield Valley, beneath yet another full moon that seemed to mark every significant turn in their unlikely story, that Draven led Ilara to the same balcony where so much of their bond had first taken shape, and knelt before her once more, though this time with an entirely different intention than that very first, startling encounter in his Moonstone chambers. "Ilara Voss," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that no battlefield or political conflict had ever drawn from him. "You entered my life as a mystery I could not explain, and you have become, in the months since, the truest partner and love I have ever known. Whatever fate first bound our wolves together, I choose you now, fully and forever, of my own free will and deepest devotion. Will you stand beside me not only as my fated match but as my queen, ruling the 12 territories together, as equals in every sense that matters?" Ilara felt tears gather freely in her eyes, overwhelmed by a happiness so complete it seemed to erase, finally and permanently, every echo of the lonely, rejected child she had once been. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Yes, Draven, I will stand beside you, now and always." Their formal union was celebrated across all 12 territories, with a joy that reflected the genuine relief and hope the resolution of the recent conflict had brought to every corner of the Wolflands. Representatives from every territory, including a carefully humbled delegation from Moonstone itself, gathered at Ashwood Hold to witness the ceremony, and Ilara stood before them all, no longer the silent, wolfless girl the world had once cast aside, but a moonborn queen, whose strength and compassion had already begun reshaping how the 12 territories understood the true measure of worth. In the years that followed, Ilara's reign alongside Draven became known throughout the Wolflands for a particular, deliberate compassion, policies enacted specifically to protect any child born different from expectation, ensuring that no hollow-born soul would ever again face the cruelty and rejection that had defined Ilara's own difficult childhood. Packs across every territory slowly adopted new practices, guided by the queen's own hard-won wisdom, celebrating rather than fearing the children, whose paths into the world looked different from tradition's narrow expectations. Ilara often found herself, in quiet moments during her long and fulfilling reign, remembering the terrified girl who had once entered a king's chambers, carrying nothing more than an evening meal and 16 years of quiet, accumulated pain. She remembered the moment his wolf had knelt before her, unable then to understand what it truly meant, and she thought, with the clarity only hindsight properly offers, of how completely that single, startling moment had reshaped the entire course of her life. She had been rejected at birth for having no wolf, dismissed as hollow by every voice that should have protected and celebrated her instead. But the wolf had never truly been absent. It had simply been waiting, patient through 16 difficult years, for the one soul capable of finally calling it home. And when the Alpha King's beast had knelt before her, it had not been recognizing weakness or failure, as Moonstone had spent her entire childhood insisting she carried. It had been recognizing, from that very first moment, exactly the extraordinary strength that had been waiting inside her all along.